gentlemen, I present to you the remarkable Dr. Ben Carson.
Thank you. Candy and I are just so delighted to be here with you this evening, and particularly for an occasion where we're celebrating something so important as education. And then the added bonus of getting to hear Chaplain Black preach, who we've known for a long time. It's great. But, you know, medicine was really the only thing that ever interested me as a youngster. I loved anything that had anything to do with medicine. For some strange reason, I was just attracted to it. And particularly listen to the mission stories in church and Sabbath school. They frequently featured missionary doctors. They traveled all over the world, great personal expense and sacrifice to bring not only physical, but mental and spiritual healing to people. They seemed to me like the most noble people on earth. And I said when I was 8 years old, I'm going to be a missionary doctor. And that was my dream. Until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like rich people. You know, they drove Jaguars, they lived in the fancy mansions, they had the big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down, stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And then, you know, I majored in psychology in college, did advanced psych in medical school. I was gung-ho. I was going to be the world's greatest psychiatrist. And then I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? Now, just kidding. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I learned very quickly is what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. What they do in real life is much more important than what they do on television. And they're some of the more intellectual members of the medical community. But it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And I believe that God gives everybody special gifts and talents. So I sat down, I started trying to figure out what are my gifts and talents. And I realized that I had a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person. I never knocked things over and said, oops. Which is a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things. And I put that together with my love of the brain from all those years thinking I was going to be a psychiatrist. And I said, you should be a neurosurgeon. A lot of people thought that was a strange idea. At that time, there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. But it didn't seem strange to me. It seemed like exactly what God had equipped me for. And I pursued that, and I became an adult neurosurgeon. But I very quickly learned that no matter how good an operation you did on those chronic back pain patients, they never got any better until they got their settlement. Whereas with the kids, you know, what you see is what you get. I mean, when they feel good, you know, they feel good. When they feel bad, you know, they feel bad. And you can operate on a kid for 10, 15, 18 hours. And if you're successful, the reward may be 40, 50, 60 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating and they die in 5 years or something else. So I like to get a big return on my investment. I'm just kidding, I like old people. But I'm one of them now. But you know, I should mention, you probably already figured this out, I'm not politically correct, okay? So don't expect that from me. believe political correctness is one of the most evil, destructive forces our country has ever had. One of the founding pillars of this nation was freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And I think our founding fathers would roll over in their graves if they could see that we had reintroduced all the restrictions on speech and expression through the back door. And it really is a tool of those who want to change the fabric of our society without discussion. And we should not listen to it. We should not stand for it. And it doesn't mean being mean to people. It doesn't mean, vulgar speech or anything like that. What it really means is civil discussion. Just bring the thing to the table and let's talk about it. The very thing that Saul Alinsky doesn't want to do. And Rules for Radicals, in his famous book, he says, never have a conversation with your adversary because that humanizes them. And your job is to demonize them. That's what they say. And that's why you see the left wing doing that all the time. And I caution people on the other side, don't fall into that trap. What I always say, when somebody comes up with an attack, I just say, now that you've completed your gratuitous attack, can we actually discuss the subject? And that kind of knocks them back on their heels. They don't know what to say then. But because you expose them immediately. Because if you don't have good talking points, then you try to change the subject. And if you can make the subject about the person as opposed to the thing that you're talking about, you have succeeded. And people have to understand those tactics so that they can make sure that they counter them in the right way. And that is very important going forward in our nation. Also recognize that there are forces in our nation, their job is to divide us. Okay? We are like pawns in a giant chess game. And they want to make us feel like we're each other's enemies. We are not each other's enemies. They are our enemies. That's what we have to understand. You got every division that they can make. Remember last year, it was the war on women? Remember that? It ended the day after the election, but it was, the war on women all over the place. And then now, racial divisions, anytime that we can form that, class or income divisions, age, gender, anything you can do to keep the people at each other's throats. Because it's much easier to control them when that is going on. And the only thing that is going to fix that is that we, the American people, have to be smarter than they, the political puppet masters. This is the only thing that's going to save us. Well, there were obstacles along the way to me realizing my dream of becoming a physician. My parents got divorced. That was devastating. And, my mother was one of 24 children. Got married when she was 13. She and my father moved from rural Tennessee to Detroit, where he was a factory worker. She discovered some years later that he was a bigamist, had another family. I remember telling that story at graduation at the University of Utah. Nobody thought it was that strange. You see that? I probably offended somebody. Everybody knows they don't do that in Utah anymore, right? Now it's Texas. But anyway, just kidding. But we had to, they got divorced. We had to move to Boston to live with her older sister, brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multi-family dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens, gangs, murders. Both of my older cousins, who we adored, were killed. I remember seeing people lying on the ground with bullet holes and stab wounds, waiting to die. It makes an impression. I remember as a 9-year-old sitting on the steps of the tenement, looking through the building across the street. The windows were broken out of it. And the sun was shining all the way through the building. And that sunbeam landing right next to me. Think about what a great God we have. I mean, He sends His beautiful sunlight everywhere. It doesn't matter where it can be Palm Springs or it can be the ghetto. Because He loves everybody in our country. He loves everybody in our world. Jesus died for everybody. And we need to keep that in mind. There's really no distinction between us. I remember an NPR interview I was doing. The interviewer said, Dr. Carson, I notice you don't speak a lot about race. Why is that? And I said, it's because I'm a neurosurgeon. And she looked at me quite quizzically, like, what the devil does that have to do with it? And I said, you see, when I take someone to the operating room and I cut that scalp and peel it down and take off that bone flap and open the dura, I'm operating on the thing that makes that person who they are. The cover doesn't make them who they are. The brain makes them who they are. That's what we have to remember. The cover was just something given to us by God because He's merciful. You know, what if He made everybody look like you? Think about that. In some cases, that'd be a national disaster. So He was kind to us to give us variety. Let's not make more of it than it is. But at any rate, you know, my mother was out working very hard, 2-3 jobs at a time, getting up at 5 in the morning and leaving and going from one job to the next job to the next job because she didn't want to be on welfare. She only had a 3rd grade education, but she was very observant. And she noticed that no one she ever saw go on welfare came off of it. So she didn't want to go on it in the first place. And she didn't want us to leave. And she was a person who never felt that she was a victim. She never felt sorry for herself. And that was a good thing. Problem is, she never felt sorry for us either. So there was never any excuse that we could give that was acceptable to her. She always would say, do you have a brain? And if the answer to that was yes, then you could have thought your way out of it. And she would say a poem called Yourself to Blame. We got to know that poem very well, and we stopped making excuses. And that was the most important thing she did for us. But she figured if she worked long enough and hard enough, eventually we'd be able to return to Detroit. And we were after a few years. Still in a multi-family dwelling, still with significant wildlife. But nevertheless, you know, she was independent. And I was a student. I was a horrible student. Perhaps the worst student you've ever seen. You know, I was always the butt of every joke about somebody being stupid. And I must admit, I really admired the smart kids. I would never tell them that, but I would sit there and say, I want to know, will they know all those answers? The teacher says something, their hand pops up. How do they know all this stuff? I had no idea. And there was one kid in particular, his name was Steve. He was the smartest kid in the class. He would always come up to you after an exam and hold his A in your face and say, look what I got, let me see yours. And you just wanted to really wallop him, but you knew you'd be in trouble. But, you know, the kind of student that I was reminds me of a lot of some of the students that I encounter today who have pretty superficial knowledge. You know, there was a survey done a number of years ago looking at the ability of 8th grade equivalents to solve so-called complex math and science problems. We were one of those 22 nations. We came in number 21 out of 22. And it was neck and neck with number 22. We barely beat them out. Math and science. And this is the technological age, the information age. Is that something that we can really afford? Do you know in the United States of America today, 30% of people who enter high school do not graduate in the information age. It wasn't such a problem during the agricultural age, when we became known as the breadbasket of the world. Not so much of a problem during the industrial age, when we could outproduce anybody. Toasters and sewing machines and cars and rockets and tanks. All you needed was a strong back and a willingness to work. But those days are gone. Now we're in the information age, the technological age. We must retool for that. I was talking to the chairman of Intel. He said, we have a lot of technological jobs, but we have to go to India and Japan and South Korea and China to fill them, because we don't produce enough people in this country to fill these high-paying technical jobs. What does that mean? That means we need to retool. We need to be telling the high school counselors that they need to be redirecting the students. Maybe we have enough international studies majors. You know, we need to start getting more people into engineering and mathematics, because that is the wave of the future. And that is our responsibility. And we can't just sit around and talk about it, because in the meantime, we're producing only a fraction of the number of engineers that are being produced in China. You know, you go to places in Africa now, and you see all these buildings and structures going up with Chinese. You know, I don't have anything against Chinese, but we need to be doing stuff. We need to be leading the way. We have the resources. What we don't have is the willpower and the right kind of direction. And there is a verse in the Bible, the book of Proverbs, which I love, 29th chapter, 18th verse. It says, without a vision, the people perish. We have to have a vision. We have to know who we are, and we have to know where we're going, or we're not going to go anywhere. That's going to always be a problem. And you know, it wasn't always like that in America. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study this country. You see, the Europeans were fascinated. They couldn't understand how in the world could a nation barely 50 years old already be competing with all of Europe on virtually every level. That's impossible. There must be a mistake. He was going to find out what it was. And he did an in-depth study. He looked at our governmental structure. He said, let me look at their educational structure. And he was flabbergasted to see that anybody finishing a second grade was completely literate. He could find a mountain man or a trapper on the outskirts of society. The person could read the newspaper. They could have a political discussion with them. They could tell them how the government worked. And if you really want to be blown away, I want you to read the education chapter in our latest book called America the Beautiful. You know, the first 4 books were written with professional co-writers. This book, America the Beautiful, was written with my wife. And it's the first one that ever made it to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And the next one that I'm writing, which will be done soon, is going to be done with her too, and I'm sure it will have a similar effect. But, you know, look at that chapter. In that chapter, there are questions extracted from a middle school exit exam from the middle 1800s in America. I hate to say it, but most college graduates today could not pass that exam. we have dumbed things down to that level. And you know, we used to really educate people. Have you ever wondered why those early pioneers were able to push across this rugged and hostile land all the way to the other sea? I'll tell you why. Because they knew how to build bridges and dams and railroads. And when something came up, they knew how to innovate. Because they were well educated. They understood fundamental principles. What has happened to us? You know, we would have never had the housing crisis that brought about this horrible situation in our country if people just still knew basic stuff. You know, when I was a kid, everybody knew you don't buy a house that costs more than 2.5 times your annual income. Everybody knew that, you know? And somebody came along saying, oh, no, you can afford this, even though it's 10 times more because your house is going to increase in value, and then you can borrow from that. And they would have told me, go jump in the lake, you fool. But, you know, now, you know, people are vulnerable simply because they lack the knowledge. And people perish for lack of knowledge. And we have got to make this a priority once again. Well, fortunately for me, you know, my mother believed in me when nobody else did. And she was always saying, Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this. I brought them home anyway, but she was always saying that. And she just didn't know what to do. My brother was doing poorly also. And she prayed and asked God to give her wisdom. And you know what? That's the wonderful thing about God. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. He is happy to hear from you. All you need to have is faith. And she had faith that he would give her the wisdom, and he did. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. I mean, turning off the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? And as far as we're concerned, that was child abuse. But not only did we have to turn off the TV, but we had to write 2 book reports each week from the public libraries and submit them to her. And we didn't know she couldn't read them. She would put little check marks and highlights and underlines and stuff. And I just hated this. This was like the worst thing in the world. And everybody else was outside playing and having a good time. There I was in the house reading books. Are you kidding me? And her friends would really criticize her. They would say, you can't make boys stay in the house reading books. They'll grow up, they'll hate me. And I would say, Mother, you know, they're right. But, you know, she didn't care, you know. She was determined that we were going to be successful. But, you know, after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books. I actually began to know some of the answers when the teacher would ask a question. And within the space of 1.5 years, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to laugh and call me names. And I remember going up to Steve. And I said, Steve, how'd you do in the exam? And he proudly poked out his chest. He said, oh, I got a 91. And I said, well, gee, that's too bad. Oh, I got 100. And I said, next time if you need help, let me know. But you know, I had the same brain in the 5th grade that I had in the 7th grade. Just a difference of opinion about who I was. And that difference of opinion emanated from learning. And that is one of the most powerful tools that we can give a person. You give a person the right kind of education. You know, it had another effect on me. As a kid growing up, I hated poverty. I detested it. Some people don't mind it. Some people detest spiders and snakes and scorpions. For me, it was poverty. That is until I started reading stories about people of great accomplishment. And as I read story after story, I began to understand one very important thing. And that is, the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's the choices that you make and the energy you decide to place behind that choice. And once I understood that, I realized that poverty didn't have to be in my future, that I could completely change that on my own. And you see, this is what we have got to reinstill into the young people of this nation. We got to get this "what can you do for me" attitude out of them and get the can-do spirit back in them. You think about the human brain. I mean, the human brain is the most fabulous gift beside his son that God gave us. I mean, billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. Remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, can process more than 2 million bits of information in a second. You can't overload it. If you learned one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to challenge the capacity of your brain. So don't ever think that you're going to overload it. You can't handle it. God has given us lots of capacity. And remember, we are made in the image of God, and God is no dummy. So we have to keep that in mind. And we should never be uttering the words, "I can't." And that's one of the reasons that Candy and I started the Carson Scholars Fund. And we have, by the way, several scholars from North Carolina, really, really smart kids. Because, you know, I go into the schools and you'd see all these trophies. Basketball, wrestling, quarterback was a big man on campus. What about the academic superstar? What do we give them? You know, think about it. Maybe National Honor Society pat on the head, they're little nerd, you know. Now compared to all the stuff that the athletes got, I mean, that was just ridiculous. So we started giving out scholarships to students in the 4th grade from all backgrounds who demonstrated superior academic performance and humanitarian qualities. They had to care about other people. And, you know, we put them on the same kind of pedestal. Give them the money, they get to wear a medal, the school gets a big trophy that goes right out there with all the other trophies, they go to a banquet, they get press attention. And we try to make it clear that there's somebody else who needs to be admired. And many teachers have told us, we put a scholar in their classroom, the GPA of the whole class goes up over the course of the next year, because now they have another kind of hero. And this is what we have got to do. We have got to put our money where our mouth is. We have got to begin to emphasize truly the importance of education. Not just talk about it. We love to talk about it, but don't let the football or the baseball stadium be 20 years old. We're ready to blow it up on CNN and build another one for $500 million, but the school can be falling apart and the books have no covers and nobody gives a care. You know, that's not politics. These are things that we clearly are going to have to change. We also need to recognize that we are a godly nation, even though there are many who are trying to say we are not. You think about some of the things that happened as this nation was being formed. You think about the Battle of New York, when Washington was down to his last battalion and they were trapped. And it looked like that was going to be the end. They were surrounded both on land and sea. And a mysterious fog came down and shielded them, and they were able to get away. And that is well documented in the meteorological records. God had his hand on them. In the Battle of Monongahela, George Washington was one of the couriers working for General Braddock of the British military. All the couriers were killed. They were all shot. Washington had 2 of his horses shot from under him. He had 4 holes in his petticoat, but no flesh wounds. And years later, still before he became president, he was in the area. One of the Indian chiefs journeyed a long way to meet him. He said, "I wanted to meet you, sir, because I am an expert marksman. I had many shots at you. Everybody else I shot fell down. You I shot, it had no effect. My men shot you, it had no effect. I told them to stop shooting you. I said, that man is protected by the Great Spirit above, and I wanted to come now and meet a leader of a great nation." That was said. That story used to be in all the American history books up until about 1935 when we started getting politically correct. You can't have any God stuff in there. Think about that. And we need to recognize that during the last Constitutional Convention, when everything was about to tear apart because everybody had different opinions, small states, large states, and before it broke apart, the senior statesman, Benjamin Franklin, stood up in front of that assembly and he said, "Gentlemen, stop." He said, "During the Revolutionary War, every other phrase out of your mouth was, 'God save us.' And now you don't even want to talk to him." He said, "Let us get on our knees and let us seek wisdom from God." And that whole assembly knelt down and they prayed. And when they got up, they put together a 16 1/3 page document known as the Constitution of the United States, which is one of the most admired documents in history. And in an article that I was writing today for next week's Washington Times column, I said, if our legislators would just read the Constitution, maybe they wouldn't spend all their time butting into everybody's lives. Well, unfortunately, I have to end, and I could still go on for quite some while. But I do have to do an appearance on the Greta Van Susteren's show tonight. I gotta go to Charlotte to do that, so keep that in mind. But I just want to close by talking again about the fact that we, the people, are at the pinnacle of the power structure as it was designed in this nation. And we have given up our rights because we have not allowed or kept up with information. And our founders said that our system of government only works with a well-educated and informed populace. Without that, it would change very rapidly because the people would be preyed upon by the media and by slick politicians. And they would have no defense because they didn't have knowledge. Lack of knowledge destroys our people. God does not want us to be simpletons. He has given us the capacity to know. Think about this. Congress has a 10% approval rating, but we return people to Congress at a rate of 90%. Now, why does that happen? Because people go into the voting booth and they're just looking for a D or an R, or they're looking for a name that they recognize. The name could be Satan. They say, "Oh yeah, I know that name." In many cases, it is. You know, we really have got to be smarter than that. And the other thing is, we have got to be brave. Do not capitulate to those people who want to shut you up by calling you names. You know, number one rule, Saul Alinsky, make the majority believe that their opinion is the minority opinion and that yours is the majority opinion, and co-opt the media if you can do that. And that way, they will all be afraid, they will shut up, and you can control them and change their society. That's exactly what they are doing. And we cannot let them do it. But it means being brave. You know, when you sing that national anthem, don't just let those words roll off without thinking about it in the end. When it says, the home of the free, land of the brave, you cannot be free if you are not brave. The two go hand in hand. Otherwise, freedom will escape us. And in closing, when Alexis de Tocqueville finished his gigantic 2-volume set, he capsulized it all at the end of the book, where he was talking about our wonderful education system and how we use the Bible in the public schools to teach values and morals to our young people. And his last sentence was, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And it is up to us to pick up our Bibles and again make America good so she can be great. Thank you very much.